Have you ever complained about having nothing to eat while staring into a packed fridge? What if your entire day's food consisted mostly of barley, some vegetables, and maybe a little bit of fish, if you were lucky? Forget pizza delivery or instant noodles. Today, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to ancient Athens to spend a day with a typical family and uncover what really landed on their plates. You might be surprised by how different and maybe how similar their meals were. Stay tuned, because what they considered a feast might change how you see your next meal.
Welcome. We're stepping into the bustling city-state of Athens around the 5th century BCE, the time of Socrates, Parthenon construction, and Athenian democracy. But beyond the famous philosophers and grand temples, ordinary families lived their daily lives, and a huge part of that life, just like today, revolved around food. But forget the lavish banquets you might imagine from movies. For the average Athenian family, let's picture a craftsman, his wife, and a couple of children. Daily meals were generally simple, wholesome, and heavily reliant on what the local land and sea could provide. Their diet was fundamentally Mediterranean, built on what historians call the Mediterranean triad: grains, grapes, and olives. Let's follow our Athenian family from sunrise to sunset and see what they're eating. The Athenian day started early, before the men headed out to the agora for business, politics, or trade, or to their workshops, and before the women began managing the household chores. They'd have a light breakfast called akritisma. Forget bacon and eggs or sugary cereals. Akritisma was incredibly simple, usually consisting of barley bread dipped in undiluted wine. Yes, wine for breakfast, though it wasn't seen as an alcoholic indulgence back then, more like a source of calories, and perhaps a way to soften the often hard, dry bread. Sometimes figs or olives might accompany the bread. It was a quick, functional meal designed to provide energy for the morning's tasks. Can you imagine starting your day like that, dipping bread in wine? It certainly puts a different perspective on breakfast. As the morning wore on, activity peaked in the city. Around noon or early afternoon, it was time for ariston, the midday meal. This was generally another light affair, not a major sit-down event like our modern lunch break might be. For a worker or someone out in the fields, ariston might be carried from home, perhaps more bread, some olives, maybe a bit of cheese, figs, or some salted fish if available. If the family was at home, it could be similar fare, possibly supplemented with some leftover vegetable stew or broth from the previous night. It was often eaten quickly, sometimes standing up. Think of it as the ancient Greek equivalent of grabbing a quick sandwich, but swap the sandwich fillings for olives and maybe some goat cheese. What's the quickest, simplest lunch you grab when you're busy? The Athenians probably had you beat on simplicity. The main meal of the day, the one where the family would ideally gather, was deipnon, eaten in the evening, usually around sunset. This was the most substantial meal. After a long day, the men returning from the agora or their work, the women having managed the household, supervised slaves if they had any, and potentially worked on weaving, the family would convene. In some households, especially more traditional or wealthier ones, men might eat separately, or at least be served first, sometimes reclining on couches, while women and children might sit on stools, or even the floor, often eating after the men had finished. But in many simpler homes, the family likely ate together. So, what was served for deipnon? The absolute staple, the core of the meal, was grain. Barley was king for the average Athenian. It was cheaper and easier to grow in the Greek climate than wheat. It was often served as a porridge or gruel called masa, which might not sound appetizing, but it was the bedrock of their diet. Wheat bread, called artos, was available, especially in the city thanks to bakers, but it was generally more expensive and considered somewhat finer than barley bread. Accompanying the masa or bread would be opson, essentially anything eaten with the bread. This is where the variety came in, depending heavily on the season and the family's income. Vegetables were common: lentils, Chickpeas, beans, onions, garlic, cabbage, and greens were frequent sights. These were often boiled or made into thick stews or soups, seasoned with herbs like oregano or thyme, and crucially, olive oil. Ah, olive oil. It wasn't just a food, it was liquid gold in ancient Greece. Olives grew abundantly, and the oil was used for everything: cooking, lighting lamps, as a soap or skin conditioner, and in religious rituals. It added flavor, calories, and essential fats to their diet. No Athenian meal would be complete without it. What about protein? Fish was a much more common source of protein for the average Athenian than meat. Athens' proximity to the sea meant fresh fish like sardines, anchovies, sprats, and mackerel were readily available in the markets, though larger fish could be expensive. Salted or dried fish was also common, providing a longer-lasting source of protein. Meat was more of a luxury. While wealthier families could afford lamb, goat, or pork more regularly, for the average family, meat consumption was often tied to religious festivals and sacrifices. When an animal was sacrificed to the gods, the edible portions were usually distributed among the community or sold cheaply. Sausages were also known. Poultry like chicken and eggs were available too, but perhaps not an everyday item for everyone. Think about that. Meat might only appear on the table during special occasions. It really highlights how plant-based their everyday diet was. And to drink? Wine. Almost always. But not like we drink it today. The Greeks almost universally drank their wine mixed with water, typically in ratios of 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric. Wine was drunk throughout the meal, served from a mixing bowl called a crater. It was a staple beverage, enjoyed by men, women, and even children, likely in very diluted forms. Did they have dessert? Not in the way we think of it. Sweetness came primarily from natural sources. Fresh fruits like figs, grapes, pomegranates, and apples when in season were common endings to a meal. Nuts like almonds and walnuts were also popular. Honey was the main sweetener, used to make simple honey cakes or drizzled over fruit or cheese. Refined sugar didn't exist in their world. Could you give up sugary desserts for just fruit and honey? Now, it's important to remember this is a snapshot of a typical family. Wealth played a significant role. Richer Athenians ate much better. More meat, more fish, finer wheat bread, imported spices, and fancier foods. They also hosted elaborate dinner parties called symposia, though these were typically all-male events focused on drinking, conversation, and entertainment, rather than family meals. On the other end, the very poor might subsist almost entirely on barley porridge, perhaps some onions or olives, and whatever they could forage or receive through charity or civic distributions. Location mattered too. Coastal families ate more fish, while inland communities relied more heavily on grains, legumes, and cheese. And let's not forget the Spartans. Their neighbors and rivals were famed for their notoriously austere diet, particularly a black broth called melas zomos, made from boiled pig's blood, pork, salt, and vinegar, which even other Greeks found disgusting. So, reflecting on the daily diet of our Athenian family, breakfast was bread dipped in wine. Lunch was light, maybe more bread, olives, and cheese. Dinner was the main event, centered around barley porridge or bread, supplemented with vegetables, olive oil, maybe some fish or cheese, and occasionally meat, all washed down with watered wine, followed by fruit or nuts. It was a diet shaped by the Mediterranean environment, relatively simple, largely plant-based, and reliant on local, seasonal produce. While perhaps lacking the sheer variety and richness we enjoy today, it was generally healthy and sustained a civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, drama, and so much more. Could you survive, or even thrive, on the ancient Athenian diet for a week? What surprised you most about what this ancient Greek family ate? Let me know down in the comments. Was it the wine for breakfast, the scarcity of meat, or the importance of barley? If you found this journey into the ancient kitchen interesting, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more explorations of history, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next trip back in time. Thanks for watching.